Today I'm going to cover 100 tips for beginner photographers, and to be honest, if you've been doing it a while, you could use this as a refresher for things that you might have forgotten. Photography is such a fun hobby, and if you stick at it, you'll be learning more and more as the years go by. I've learnt things, I've had those aha moments, and sometimes skills will fall by the wayside when I haven't been using them for a while. So your skills will be evolving all of the time. But today I thought I'd go over 100 of those tips that could help you as a photographer. And if I've missed anything, let me know in the comments below. Now the first tip is to use auto as a safety net. You might have something that's going on in front of you, or you might get confused with your settings. If this is the case, know that you can switch it back to that green box and you'll be able to just take the photo of what's happening in front of you, and then you can go back to the settings or go back to what you were learning in the first place. But know that you have that auto as a safety net. The next tip is to start shooting in RAW. RAW is such a good way of getting a lot more data than you would with JPEGs. JPEGs are good, but RAW files will give you a lot more data and you'll be able to recover a lot more if you get your settings out a little bit. When you're shooting portraits, use a wide aperture, so that's getting the f number as low as possible. What this will do is it'll tend to get the background out of focus and it'll separate your portrait from that background. While we're on the subject of portraits, you want to use a longer focal length as well. So if you're on a crop sensor camera and you're using the kit lens, which is normally an 18-55, shoot at 55mm. Or if you've got a full frame camera and you're using a 24-70, use the 70mm end. This will help get that background out of focus again. Now, when you are shooting those portraits and you want to learn about aperture, aperture priority is the way to go. This gives you control over aperture, and as long as you've got your ISO in ISO auto, that's the only thing that you need to control. Then you can get that f number as low as possible, the aperture as wide as possible, and kick that background out of focus. On the other hand, if your subject is moving fast, say you're shooting sports or anything like that, you'll want to control that shutter. And this is where shutter priority comes in. This gives you control over shutter, and then the camera controls everything else, as long as you have that ISO in auto. Now, going back to those blurry background shots, you want to move your subject away from the background to get that background more blurry. You might only have a kit lens, which might be f4 to f5.6, but the more distance between your subject and the background, the more likely that background is to be blurry. And this leads me on to the next tip, which is if you still can't get that background out of focus, then move closer to your subject. The closer you are to the subject and the further away your subject is from the background, the more likely that background is to be blurry. Now that's pretty much all of the things I'm going to talk about with that blurry background. So if you're sick of those blurry background shots, that's all the tips that I'm going to have for blurry background shots. The next tip is learn to use the flash in manual mode. What you'll find is if you take a photo with a flash and it's in the automatic modes, which are the TTL or the ETTL modes, what you'll find is it may take a good shot, but it may take a bad shot. And when you're troubleshooting it, you can't work out, or you might not be able to work out why it's done that. If you're in manual mode, it's a lot easier to troubleshoot. And also, you'll learn a lot more about flash photography and about how it works. I've actually done a tutorial on flash photography, so if you haven't seen it yet, click on the eye in the corner or the link in the description. The next tip is don't be afraid to raise your ISO. Modern cameras, and especially modern cameras in the last 5 years, have really good ISO ranges. And you'll be surprised about how far you can push it before you get noise in your image. And this brings me on to the next point again. Noise is better than blur. So if you raise your ISO, you'll get more sensitivity in the sensor. Now, I know there's more to it than that, but we're just talking on layman's terms now. So the ISO raises the sensitivity of the sensor, and then it means you can shoot with a faster shutter speed. So you're less likely to get blur in your shots, and you're more likely to get a usable shot. The next tip is to learn how to use exposure compensation. When you are shooting in that aperture priority or shutter priority control, what you'll find is the exposure compensation will allow you to nudge that exposure one way or the other. So if the camera hasn't quite got it right, you can use exposure compensation to darken your shot a bit or brighten it up a little bit. Now, unless you want a really shallow depth of focus shot, get your camera to its preferable aperture. It's normally around about f8, but can range between f5.6 and f11. I shoot a lot of portraits for corporate companies, and I normally shoot them between f5.6 and f8. They do come out really sharp. If you have it at the widest aperture, and if you have something like the Tamron lenses that have an aperture of f2.8, or maybe a prime that goes down to f1.8 or f1.4, sometimes when you're at those really wide apertures, you'll get the eye in focus, but the end of the nose will be out of focus and the ear will be out of focus as well. I much prefer to shoot at f5.6 to f8, where the whole of the face is in focus. Next, learn the rule of thirds. This is by far one of the best things that you can learn to sort of develop your compositional techniques. You do need to know the rule to know when to use it and when to break it. This leads me on to the next tip, and that is to ignore people who say the rule of thirds is rubbish. They have probably moved on from being a beginner and they've ditched that. They've gone on to more advanced techniques. But learning the rule of thirds is one of the principal things that you need to know to really work on your compositions and get more compelling photographs. The next tip is to focus on the eyes. This is why there's been such a big push recently from the camera companies to get great eye autofocus, and it's well worth it. You could shoot in manual, and I remember years ago shooting on film where I had to manual focus on the eyes, and it was really hard work. With eye autofocus, it's fantastic that at just a press of a button, it can focus on the eye, and a lot of the times it will get it spot on. When you do take a photograph, you do need to patrol the edges of that photograph. If something creeps into your shot and you're not aware of it, it can sometimes ruin the photo completely. Now, you can Photoshop it out, but it's better to know what's in your frame and just do a little look around that frame before you take the photograph. Now you've got your camera and you've spent a lot of money on that camera, it's worth investing a little bit of money in an app like PhotoPills, the Photographer's Ephemeris, or Planet Pro. One of these will give you so much information about the location that you're going to be shooting at. I use PhotoPills all the time when I'm going out and shooting. It'll tell me where the sun is, it'll tell me where the light's going to be coming from, and it'll tell me where the sun's going to be if I'm just scouting a location. It's really good and it's well worth it. I think it's around about $9.99 at the moment. When you are using your camera, you really need to learn to use the histogram. This is an essential tool to help you get a better balanced shot. Sometimes the screen on the back of your camera might be turned down in brightness, or it might be really bright. And this can kind of trick your eye a little bit, and you might then underexpose if it's too bright, or overexpose if it's too dark. So make sure you know how to read a histogram and make sure you have it on so you know that you're getting your photograph spot on. When you take a photograph, it's quite easy to miss what's going on in the background if you've got a very compelling subject. So you need to keep an eye on your background and what's in it. It's amazing how easily you can miss something that is so distracting. From time to time, you need to look through your photos and see if there's been any improvement. Try and learn what you are doing wrong and what you need to work on. I do this from time to time and I look through my photographs and then I can work out what I do need to work on. There may be skills that I've forgotten, or there may be things that I'm overlooking that I need to focus more on. And looking back through my work really helps me do this. Now this links me into the next tip, which is to invest in a good photo editing program. It might be Adobe or Capture One or Darktable. And I'm not talking about money, but I'm talking about time as well. It's really good to invest time into learning an editing program properly. Whether you get lessons in it, you invest in a course, or anything like that. Once you get that editing program, learn as much as you can about it so you know it inside out. As well as looking at your own photographs, it's worth finding a mentor. This could be someone online or in person, but having someone that is on the next level or is much better than you, having a look at your photos and giving you that critical feedback is really important to help push you and your photography. Now this next tip is a simple one, but it's often overlooked, and sometimes I find myself forgetting this one, but it's learning how to hold your camera properly. This is not so important when there's a lot of light about, but when you're shooting into the evening, or if you're on a really long lens, you really need to hold that camera properly. And that is getting those elbows in, holding up to your face so the camera is nice and solid and nice and static. Now I've already mentioned shooting in RAW, but once you do shoot in RAW, know that white balance is not that important in taking the photo, but more important in the editing stage. Now if you shoot JPEGs, you do need to get your white balance right. so it's worth learning about white balance. This next tip is more of an exercise, and it's about switching your camera to manual and heading out to a park or somewhere nearby where you live where there is no pressure to get the shot, and learn about that manual mode. Now this leads me into the next tip, which is learning how to set your camera up properly. Mainly where to access and change your principal settings, and that's aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Now while we're on the subject of gear, don't think that you have to buy the best gear straight away. Photography is a hobby that will last for years, and you'll build up a decent set of gear over time. I started off with a camera and a kit lens, and I had that and nothing else for quite a while. I did buy a few lenses probably a couple of years after that, but the camera and the kit lens did a great job, and it taught me a lot about photography. This next tip again is about gear, and it's having a camera setup that you can take everywhere with you. The best camera is the one that you have with you, because if it's sat at home, you're not going to take a photograph with it. So make sure you've got a small, compact setup that you can carry with you. This is one of the reasons why I've got the A6600 and the kit lens. I can easily chuck that over my shoulder, it's really small and it doesn't get in the way, and I can get much better photographs than I could with my camera phone. Now the difference between someone who takes snapshots and someone who takes photographs is planning. So plan some photographs you want to take. This is a case of finding a location, maybe online or on some maps, and then kind of planning what you're going to do, what you're going to photograph, when you're going to take it, and how you're going to take it. Now, all of that time will be wasted if you don't actually go out and do the shots that you've planned. So the next tip is to go and do those shots that you have planned and that you've spent all of that time finding those locations to shoot. You may have to go a few times, but if you do, you'll end up with some amazing photographs instead of snapshots. When photographing a subject, be it a person, a place, or an object, work around that subject. Shoot it from different angles, different focal lengths, and different heights. It's amazing what you can get and how different you can make your subject look. As well as shooting your subject from lots of different angles, you need to take photographs regularly. I'm talking like every week. If you don't do this, you might learn some skills, but then if you don't pick your camera up for a few months, you'll probably lose those skills. So make sure you take photographs regularly. Now, if you're thinking about getting into landscape photography, do a sunrise landscape shoot. This will either help you fall in love with landscape photography or make you realize you're not really a morning person and maybe landscape photography is not for you. Now with your three principal settings, that's aperture, shutter speed and ISO, they all interact with each other. And learning about the exposure triangle helps you to understand this a little bit better. If you get a good exposure and you change one of your settings, you need to compensate with one of the other two settings. And this is what the exposure triangle will teach you. Now, if you're not a morning person and you still want to get into landscape photography, you'll need to start photographing sunsets or around about sunset time where you live. You'll be amazed at how different a scene will look from in the middle of the day compared to at sunset or sunrise. So if you're not a morning person, photograph sunsets. Now this leads me into the next tip, which is if you're not a morning person and you do photograph sunsets, learn how to Photoshop people out of your photographs. You'll be surprised at how many people will be at a location at sunset compared to sunrise, where you'll probably get the scene to yourself. The next tip is to photograph everything. So if you're going to party, take your camera. If you're going for a hike in a really nice landscape, again, take your camera. And if you're going to visit friends or family, take your camera again. If you photograph as many things and as many different subjects as possible, you'll start to learn intuitively how to use your camera, and then you'll learn what works in what certain setting. The more photographs you take, the better you'll get with that camera. Now, if this isn't possible, find some events near you and go and photograph those events. Be it a running event, a car race, some bikers going down a downhill trail. There are a lot of events around you. Well, as long as there's not a global pandemic going on, that is. So events are great because you basically have the subject there ready and waiting for you to photograph. You've just got to get the right settings and get yourself in the right location to shoot that event. Now the next tip is more to do with landscapes, and it's about finding different locations to shoot the same subject. So say for instance you're shooting a mountain, it's a very prominent mountain, there may be one location that everyone photographs from. What I want you to do is go for a hike around that mountain as long as it's safe and find different angles to shoot that same subject from. If you do this through either scouting that location or planning and going and doing that shot, what you'll find is you'll get a very unique photo that is basically yours. As well as changing locations, you want to go there at different times of the day. You'll be amazed at how different one subject can look when the light is coming from different angles. When you do find a good composition, try and see if you can find some shapes in that composition and try and incorporate them into your photograph. It's amazing when you get certain shapes like circles, triangles, diagonals into your shots, and it makes the shot a lot more compelling. As well as shapes, look for leading lines to draw the viewer into your shot. If you've got a path, a road, or a river, or maybe some ripples in the sand, these can really draw the viewer's eye into the shot and towards your subject. The next tip is to get the sun into your frame and make it burst. A tip here is to shoot with high aperture numbers, let's say f11 to f18. What you'll find is different lenses will give different star bursts, but if you get your settings right with those smaller apertures, with those high f numbers, the sun will start to burst and any pinpoint lights will burst as well. You'll get those lines coming out of them and it can really make your photographs pop. When you are exploring your subject when taking landscape photographs, look for a good foreground element. It might not work to start with, but if you do look for them, it will start to train your mind to think in the right way. And when you do find one that really links in and really works well in your photograph, it'll really make your photograph stand out. Now the next tip is to emulate, then create. If you see a photo you like of a place you're visiting or a place that is nearby to where you live, try to recreate that photograph first of all. So that's where you emulate, but then see if you can find a better photograph of that same subject or see what other photographs are around in that location. You'll learn a lot by emulating others, but then you'll learn so much and you'll become your own photographer when you do start to get your own photographs. The next tip is to try astrophotography. I have a lot of tutorials on astrophotography, but it's one of those things that if you get into and you actually get to a really dark location with a sky full of stars, it's quite inspiring and it kind of makes you realize that the universe is absolutely massive. I could sit underneath the stars, and I have sat underneath the stars all night. The next tip is to realize it takes a few days to recover from a full night of astrophotography. When you have driven to the location, you're awake all night, and then you drive back home the next day. It's amazing how much that can take it out of you and how long it takes to recover. If you're photographing a big landscape, try to find something that gives it scale. Whether it's a person in the shot, a building, a boat, or a plane, just put something in the frame to show how big it is and how grand it looks. That one thing, if it's small in the frame, will make it look even more grand. When you do get to a location and you're photographing a scene, you might be surprised at what you see behind you. So make sure you look around and see what's about, because as that sky develops, and if you get one of those really nice skies where the sunlight catches the bottom of the clouds, you might have an even better scene that's right behind you. And you might miss it if you don't look around. So that's 50. Just gonna have a quick break and then we'll do the next 50. Once you've taken your photographs, back them up as soon as you can. This might not be for a while, but as soon as you get home and as soon as you have access to your computer and a hard drive, back them up. And once you've backed up your SD cards, clear them as soon as you can so you format them in camera. I've had so many times where I've copied the SD cards and I've forgotten which ones I've copied, but I haven't formatted them, and I end up with a case full of SD cards that are full and I don't know which ones are formatted and which ones are not. It's a really bad habit to get into, so make sure as soon as you back up your photos, you format your SD cards so they're ready for the next time you go out shooting. The next tip is to delete the rubbish photos, and I mean the ones that are really badly out of focus or they've got horrible motion blur. You just want to get rid of those because they'll just take up space. I've got a whole drawer of hard drives and I need to go through them, and I know there's a lot of photos on them that I'm going to delete. I haven't done that for ages and I really need to. So get into the habit of deleting those rubbish photos, and I mean getting them completely off your hard drive. When you buy memory cards, you want to spend more money than you think. The speed of the card will really slow you down, and it'll slow you down at the worst possible moment. There'll be something amazing happening in front of you, and then your camera will be clearing the buffer. And the speed at which it clears the buffer does depend on the speed of card that you've bought. So spend as much as you can on that SD card. And while we're on the subject of SD cards, buy more than one memory card. They can and do fail, and you'll kick yourself if you don't have a backup. There's nothing worse than going out to a location, having a card corrupt, and then not having a backup card to use, so you don't have anything to save any of the photos to. Now, mirrorless cameras have developed so much over the last 10 years, and they will really help you learn at a much quicker rate than with a DSLR or with a film camera. By this, I mean that if you're looking through the viewfinder or looking at the screen on the back of the camera, it'll show you what the photograph is before you've taken it. So you can look at it and you can work out how that photograph looks before taking it. And this is such a good learning tool, and it'll help you learn photography a lot quicker than if you're shooting with film or you're shooting on a DSLR. With a DSLR, you're looking through the lens and you're kind of looking with the dynamic range of your eye. So you'll see a lot more detail through an optical viewfinder of a DSLR. Whereas with a mirrorless camera, that's a readout of the sensor, so it will give the dynamic range of that sensor. Now, on the flip side of this, mirrorless cameras will make you a lazy photographer. And that's because of what I've just said. You'll be able to look on the back of the camera and work out whether it's a good shot or not. And this really does make you lazy. I started back in the 90s on film, and the learning process was really slow. I then transferred across to DSLRs, but I still had a lot of those skills I learned back in the 90s. And now I have some of those skills that I learned on DSLRs, but now shooting with mirrorless cameras, a lot of those skills have kind of gone by the wayside. I don't need them anymore, and I'm not developing them anymore. So it is making me a bit of a lazy photographer. A lot of entry-level cameras will have a built-in flash. If you do have this, turn it off completely. There's nothing that will make you look more like an amateur than if that flash pops up, especially if you're taking a photograph of a massive landscape. Now, every camera comes with a manual, and it's well worth reading that manual. It may surprise you as how much your camera can actually do. Even the entry-level cameras have so many functions nowadays. And if you don't utilize all of them, or you don't know about them, you won't know which ones you can use to help you get better photographs. You won't know which ones that you don't really need at all. So read the manual and learn all about your camera. The next tip is to try and get some critical feedback. Now, by this, I don't mean your mum saying she loves your photographs or the numerous gushing comments on Facebook or Instagram. This is a professional looking at your photographs from a professional's point of view. However, when you do get that critical feedback, don't take it personally. They're trying to help you become a better photographer. And as long as it is critical feedback, you can learn from what they're saying by looking at your photograph from another person's point of view. Now, if you have got some critical feedback recently and your ego does feel a little bit bruised, what you want to do is share your photos online. All of those gushing comments will probably make you feel a little bit better again. Now, when you do share your photos online, don't share them across multiple Facebook groups. The same people will probably be in those groups, and the last thing they'll want to see is 5 of the same picture in 5 different groups. They'll normally pop up on the feed at the same time. Now, if you're adamant about doing this, just share them on different days. Now, I know you need to promote yourself online as a photographer, but spread it out and do it logically. People can really see through this, and even though you're being genuine and sharing your work, people might not see it that way. The next tip is to shoot at the eye level of your subject. So if you're photographing kids, get down to their eye level. If you're photographing dogs, get down to their level. If you're photographing, say, snakes in the grass or anything like that, get to their level. The next tip is to learn about the shutter focal length rule when shooting handheld, and then see how much you can break this rule by. This is basically where you take your focal length and you match that number to your shutter speed. So let's say you're shooting with a 50mm lens, you keep it at 1/50th of a second. This is with full frame cameras, so you need to work the conversion if you are on crop sensed cameras. But if you are doing this, see how far you can drop that shutter speed by. If you hold the camera properly, you should be able to drop it lower. And also, if you've got good IBIS, that's in-body image stabilization, you should be able to drop it a bit more. But it's good to know how slow you can take your shutter speed for a given focal length. Then you'll know when you can shoot handheld and when you might have to stabilize the camera in another way. Now, this brings me on to the next tip, and it's knowing when to use a tripod. Tripods are great because you don't have to start bumping up your ISO, you don't have to start compromising with other things. The tripod will keep your camera perfectly steady. You can keep that ISO low and get a really nice, clean, crisp image. I've got some of my favorite shots by using a tripod at night or when the light is dropping a lot. Now, when it comes to gear, you want to try and carry less of it. When you've got a bag full of stuff, it's an absolute nightmare. And if you do that for years, you'll end up with a bad back. So try and carry less gear. Now, if you have more than one lens, just try and take one lens with you on one day. It's amazing how free you'll feel not having a bag full of camera kit. I try and do this with different lenses on different days just to see how I feel about those lenses. And also, you'll learn a lot about shooting with that one focal range when you have that one lens on your camera and you won't have the choice of any others. Now, this next tip relates to planning your photographs, but if you have a shot in mind, scout that location to see if it's any good. You can then use the app PhotoPills or a planning app like that to see where the light will be coming from, and it'll help in that planning stage by scouting that location. Now, sometimes the weather can be absolutely awful, and the last thing you want to do is go out and take photographs. But this is really the time that you really should go out. It's amazing how different locations can look in bad weather, even if you have to buy a jacket for your camera to stop it from getting wet. Now, I've already talked about shooting at sunrise and sunset, and that's because of the golden hour. The light in this time can be absolutely fantastic, and you can get some really nice shots, and it can make your job as a photographer a lot easier. So if you do go out, make sure you try and go out in the golden hour just to see how different they'll look compared to the middle of the day. Now, in photography, there are different types of rules to help you and guide you along the way. But you do need to know that you can break all of the rules when you want to, but you do need to know them first, especially the rule of thirds. Now, the next tip is to take your time learning photography and learn to enjoy the process of learning. I look at other people's work sometimes and I think I'm a rubbish photographer. And then I look at my photos from years ago and realize how far I've come. In taking time to learn photography and taking years to process this art, you'll really come into your own and you'll really develop that photography and develop your photography skills. Now, this next tip links into the last one, and it's not to get yourself down by looking at all of the great work that's already out there, especially with the likes of Instagram and photography sites like that. There's some amazing work there, and it's quite easy to let yourself feel down and kind of look at your photographs and think they're rubbish when you do look at those bits of work. But try not to get yourself down by looking at them too much. Again, this leads into the next tip, and that's to look at the amazing work online and try and figure out how they took it. So instead of feeling down about all that amazing work, try and work out how they took it, work out when they took it, and work out the location they took it. Then you can emulate their work and then create your own bits of work, maybe at that location or maybe at another similar location, but then you'll make it your own. Now, one unlikely place you can learn about photography is by watching TV and watching TV series and films. It's amazing how much effort they put into the lighting in every one of their scenes. I sometimes annoy my wife by telling her exactly how a certain scene in a favorite show was created, or I sometimes point out the lighting faults in that show, and then she can't help but spot them. But this is a great exercise to do, so when you are watching an interview or you're watching a drama, try and see how they've lit certain scenes. I really enjoy doing that, and it does teach me so much about lighting. Now, the next tip is to tell a story with a group of photographs. Sometimes you'll go to a place or you'll be at an event, you'll take a load of photographs and then you'll just dump them all online. It won't really tell a story. But if you can narrow it down to 20 to 30 photographs at most and tell a story, say if you're at an event, you'll get some shots of people getting ready, you'll get some shots of the start, you'll get some shots of the people competing, then maybe crossing the finish line, you'll have a story arc. And if you narrow this down to 20 shots, it'll make your photographs a lot more compelling. Now, this links into this next tip, and that's try to reduce the amount of photos you need to tell the story. You'll find that some photographers will get one photo that tells the story of that whole scene, and then other photographers might have to take a few more. It does all depend on the subject, and it does all depend on the story you want to tell. But try and tell that story in as few photos as possible. Now, as you get to know your camera, you want to start playing with shutter speed to create motion. You'll find as you drop the shutter speeds by increments, When you move the camera, you'll start to create a bit of blur. Now, if your subject is in motion, you can learn to pan with the motion of your subject. And if you drop that shutter speed, you can then start getting those speed blurs in your shots. So the next tip is to learn to pan with the motion of your subject. If you get lucky with a great shot, but you don't have a clue how you got it, go back over the settings that you took and what you might have done to get that photograph. In doing this, you'll learn a lot from it. Then you'll be able to emulate that and start getting those shots purposefully instead of fluking them. If you shoot with a zoom lens, which you probably might do if you're a beginner because that kit lens is a zoom lens, try shooting the same subject at different focal lengths, say wide from near and far, and then telephoto from near and far, and then mix up the height you shoot from as well. Again, you're getting that same subject from different perspectives, different focal lengths, so it's amazing what you can actually do with a zoom lens. Now, we live in a 3D space and try to record it on a 2D plane. So you need to add depth by layering your photographs. This is done by adding a foreground element, or maybe adding a background element, or getting that background out of focus. By adding more and more planes, you'll add more and more depth to your photographs. As I've already mentioned, the rule of thirds is a great tool to use to kind of lay out your photograph. But if you try to break that rule for a day or maybe a week, what you'll find is you'll think about it more often and it'll become more of a subconscious thought as to whether you follow that rule or break that rule. Now, when you're photographing quick moving subjects, use burst mode. You'll find that as that subject goes past, you might try and get that fleeting moment. And if you just click one photograph, it's almost impossible to get. Whereas if you've got it in burst mode, especially with these newer cameras that have really high burst modes, you're more than likely to get the moment that you want. Now, when photographing a subject, it's quite easy just to shoot it all in landscape or all in the portrait mode. So make sure you get the same subject in both portrait and landscape. So that's horizontal and vertical. Then you'll find out what works better when your camera's in that vertical position, and then what works better when the camera's in that flat position. Now, if your subject is unpredictable, shoot in aperture priority with ISO auto and at f8. There was a famous photographer called Arthur Weegee Phillig, and his quote was f8 and be there. Now, what he meant by that, at f8, you're more than likely to get your subject in focus and capture that moment. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what photography is about a lot of the time, is capturing that moment. Now, if your subject moves really fast, shoot in shutter priority. This will give you control over how fast that shutter is and how you freeze that fast motion. If you want more blurriness in your shot, you drop the shutter speed. Whereas if you want to freeze that motion, you raise the shutter speed. But in shutter priority, this gives you control over the shutter. Now, there are so many different genres in photography. And if you stick to one genre, try shooting something you haven't photographed before. Photographing something in a completely different genre can really bring more tools and bring more skills back to what you normally photograph. As they say, a change is as good as a break. So you'll still be learning camera skills and photography skills, but doing something completely different. And you never know, you might find a different genre that you like and then you add to your repertoire. This next tip is a quick one and it's to fill the frame. So if your shots are looking boring and the people or whatever you're photographing in the frame is small, get closer to it or zoom in and get it filling that frame. And this next tip links to that last one, and it's get closer to the details. If you do get closer to your subject and you fill the frame with your subject, you'll be able to show the details, the texture, and the really intricate bits to your subject. Next, study the masters of art. You'll learn a lot about composition and lighting from ancient works of art. It can be photography, it can be Renaissance paintings or anything like that. It's amazing how good some of the masters are at capturing light and capturing an amazing composition. The next tip is another pet peeve of mine, and that's to turn your lens hood around. If you've got it on your lens, you might as well use it, because then it doesn't get in the way and it actually does the job that it's designed for. There's nothing worse than seeing a person who has a really expensive camera and the lens hood is on backwards. It looks amateurish, so don't do it. Now, when it comes to megapixels, there is still an ongoing battle. Like, you've got the A7R4 that shoots at 60 megapixels. It's crazy. But megapixels matter less than you might think. You could give a camera that has a 6 megapixel sensor to a really good photographer, they'd still be able to get an amazing shot. So megapixels matter less than you think. Now, if you want to try something new, get a prime lens and shoot with it for a week. It's amazing how limiting a prime lens feels to start with, but then how much it makes you think about photography and think about your framing a lot more. A prime lens is a fixed lens, so it's not a zoom lens. It is fixed to one focal length and that's it. So if you can't get the framing, you need to move yourself to get a better framing or to get the framing that you want. And it does teach you so much about photography. The next tip is to try long exposure photography. It's not for everyone, but it is another thing to add to your set of skills. Either in the city at night, if it's safe that is, a fireworks event, or a landscape under a moonlight. Or if you've got some ND filters, try it with some strong ND filters on the front of your lens in the middle of the day. Like I've already said, long exposures aren't for everyone, but you might find that you might really enjoy taking long exposures. Now, if it's been pouring down with rain, this is a great time to look for reflections. And even if it hasn't been raining, look for puddles, look for small pools, and look for lakes. When it's perfectly flat, you can get a perfect reflection in that. And it doesn't matter if the pool is really small. You can sometimes get a tiny little puddle, and if you get low enough to it, you'll get a perfect reflection in that water. Now, when you're photographing, it's sometimes easy to let the horizon drift out a little bit. So the next tip is to keep an eye on your horizon. You need it either perfectly flat, or you need to tilt it out by around about 10 degrees. But if it's only out by a few degrees, it just looks like you've made the mistake. Now, if you have made that mistake, reframe it when editing. It's very easy just to reframe it and flatten it out, but just make sure your horizon is flat in your photographs before you put them online. Now, tip 99 is to learn to edit your photographs. It's one thing to know how a program works, and it's one thing to know how your camera works, but you need to bring those two together. So every time you go out and take a set of photographs, make sure you edit those, and make sure you put some time into learning to get the best out of them. Now, we finally got there. This is tip 100, and that's to make mistakes and don't worry about making them. And actually not encourage making them, but when you do realize you've made a mistake, kind of laugh at yourself when you realize what you've done. If you can do this, you'll learn so much from those mistakes, and before you know it, you'll become a very, very good and a very accomplished photographer. So, have I missed anything at all? I think I pretty much covered most of the tips that you'll ever need as a photographer. If you can think of any others, let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, click here next. And if you want to binge watch a load of my tutorials, click down here. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for weekly tutorials in photography. I'll see you next time.